You might see a slide title like this and it throws you off a little bit, but CRUD is actually an acronym that we find in programming, or at least informally in programming, and it's an acronym that refers to the most common data operations that we do when we have a data-driven web application. There are 4 operations that are very, very common with applications that deal with data. You have create, where the C comes from. In SQL, this is an insert, or you might think of it as an add. Read, in SQL, this is select, or you might think of finding or getting from some of the more object-oriented query languages out there. Update, which is an edit, and then finally delete, and most people know what that is. That's when you're actually removing the data from the system, and this is where the acronym comes from, because generally speaking, whatever kind of model or business entity you have in your application, you are probably going to be doing all 4 of these things. Although sometimes deleting is a little tricky, so maybe you'll just do 3 or so, but it's very common to do all 4 of them together. Since these are so common, MVC4 gives us a way to automatically generate some code to help us get there, and this is called scaffolding. Scaffolding is an automated way to build controllers and views from a model. So if you get your model nice and defined, you can actually use MVC4 to automatically create controllers and even views for you to get you set up to do creates, reads, updates, and deletes. It's very basic boilerplate code, so you probably won't want to just scaffold every entity you have and then put all that into production. That's going to be kind of a boring website, and it's not going to be very customized to your operations or contain any of your business logic or anything like that. So you will need to mess with it a little bit, but it is a great starting point. It gets you all the basic forms that you need, the hyperlinks that you need, and the basic data access controllers that you need. It gets you all set up so then you can customize it and fill it out. So even to this very day, even though I've made many MVC applications, I still use scaffolding a lot to give me a starting point, and then I go in and modify it. It's especially beneficial if you're just starting out, not just because it gives you some ready-made views and controllers that are built around your model, but because when you see the code that it generates, it's a great way to learn basic CRUD operations from an MVC perspective, to learn what kind of code goes into a controller to do data operations, or what your view should include if you're making your own views. And by looking at that generated code, you can get a very good starting point even in your own mind for code that you may want to write or develop yourself. I want to take a look at scaffolding now, and in order to do this, I've got this application that I've built using the default Internet Application template from the MVC4 framework. So it's got some pre-made things in it, like the account models. But one thing I've got are these 3 classes that have been added to the models folder: author, genre, and book. And I just want to give a quick look at how scaffolding can actually work. Now, I haven't actually built the solution yet because I want to show you a real common mistake that people make. And by people, I mean me. I do this all the time, even though I really should know better. I haven't built this solution yet. So when I try to use scaffolding, let's say, for instance, I right-click on my Views folder, and I say Add, and I come over here to View. This gives me my scaffolding dialog here. I create a strongly typed view. There's no models in my drop-down, even though I clearly have them. And that's because the application doesn't know you've got models until you build them. So all the time I will add models to the models folder, and then I'll try to scaffold and I won't find them in the drop-down, and that's because I didn't build. So I'm going to come over here and right-click and say Build Solution or Build Project down here at the project level, whatever you like to do. But now that it's built, now when I come down here and I do the scaffolding, if I create Add View, and let's create a strongly typed view. Okay, now all kinds of classes are in here, right, because I built. So if you ever try to come here and your model class isn't here, make sure you've built your solution. So let's say I want to make an authors page. So I can come here and pick whatever model I want to make a page for, and then it asks me what scaffold do I want to use. Do I want to just have an empty scaffold where I just add my own code for everything? Do I want to create a page that lists all my authors, a page to edit an author, a page to view the details of a single author, a page to delete an author, or a page to create an author? Now, if you notice, this list matches up with your basic CRUD operations. Create, read, update, and delete. So let's say I want to make a page to create a new author. Okay, so probably what I would want to do is actually create an authors folder before I did this. So let me do that. And spell it correctly. Okay, I'm going to right click over here, add view. I'm going to call this the create view. Once again, I'm following the naming conventions that MVC will pick up on automatically. Go here to author, pick the create scaffolding template, and off I go. Now you notice what it does is it creates a view for me that has a form that I can use to add a new author. Okay, here's a label for the name. It creates a validator for the name. Now you'll notice that there's no form field here for ID. You know, if you look at my author class, there's an author ID field. Well, by default, the MVC framework will not scaffold for your ID properties, because most databases, when you save, will generate the ID for you. You don't actually create the ID. Now you can of course add that field in here on your own if you wanted to. You can see from the code we could just copy and paste this code and stick model.authorID in both of those fields, and then we're done. But the scaffolding assumes that the database is going to generate this field for you, so it gives you a nice little form here. So if I launch this guy, it's going to come up with the default page, and I go to author, create, let's see, oh, because I don't have a controller yet. That would be a good thing to do. So let's add a controller. I'm going to come down here to controller, add controller, and this is going to be my author controller. Now, when I add a controller, I have several different possibilities. For instance, I can have an MVC controller with read-write actions and views using Entity Framework, an MVC controller with empty read-write actions, an empty Web API controller, and then some options for using Entity Framework. I want to make it very clear that you do not have to use Entity Framework with your MVC. If you want to use in Hibernate or Open Access or any other object relational mapper, or even if you don't want to use an ORM, or even if you don't want to use a database, the MVC framework will support all of that. It just so happens that in your scaffolding options, because obviously this is Microsoft, they have a lot of built-in stuff if you're going to use Entity Framework. So if you haven't actually settled on a decision, you might want to go ahead and use Entity Framework, because there's so many things already built into it. So for instance, if I chose one using Entity Framework, it asked me what model class I want to use, and it also asked me for my data context, okay, which I don't actually have a data context yet, but if I just picked author, just so you can see the controller, it doesn't recognize the data context. So I could create a new data context, but just so I don't get into a bunch of Entity Framework stuff, what I'm going to do is just use the MVC controller with empty read-write actions for the time being. And so here, notice I've got my index, I've got my details, I've got all the different default CRUD views. And so here, now this is not red because I have the create view already done. Let's see if it'll let me pull it up here. It should. Alright, and here's the view that was created by scaffolding. So, this isn't going to do anything because I need to add code to save it to a database or whatever, and if we're using Entity Framework, we can scaffold that as well. But otherwise, we're going to need to create that code ourselves. But as you can see, this gives me a perfectly workable form, and then I can customize this to be whatever it is that I want.